Okay, Jen. It's 11:03. Do you think we should get started?
Sure. Thank you, Kate.
Yeah, I can keep monitoring the waiting room and the chat. But yeah, thanks for joining us all today, folks, for the Navigating and Understanding Evidence-Based, Research-Based, and SOR-Approved webinar, led by Chen Wang. And I'll let you get started.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here today. I'm excited to spend this time with you as we navigating and understanding these terms. So, evidence-based or research-based SOR approved. I know that these terms are everywhere. Maybe you have heard a lot in some of your professional development sessions, in the curriculum materials you use in the classroom, and you could also see them on a lot of vendors' websites, right? But what do they actually mean? And more importantly, how can we differentiate them to, avoid the snake oil that just are some marketing claims? And how do we find the things that truly works for students? So these will be our today's focus. We will start by unpacking three terms that are often used interchangeably, but actually mean different things. Those three labels that we see, although they're not all the same, understanding their differences is critical when evaluating the effective, literacy programs, tools, or products you may use. With so many options out there, it's easy to get pulled in by programs that sound impressive, but actually lack some real impact that really works for students. And then our next objective, we will explore how to assess the strengths of the research and quality of evidence that actually support a program or practice. Because not all evidence behind a program is created equal. So I will share a few practical components that help distinguish between high quality evidence and weaker or more anecdotal claims. And finally, we will look at how to determine what works for students in the real world settings. We want to recognize the red flags in those that may look polished but lack strong evidence and develop our radar for spotting some programs and products that are scientifically sound, especially aligned with the science rating with high quality evidence. And to begin this journey, I like to start with the term the science of reading. It's a buzzword that we are hearing so much. Everyone talks about it, especially everyone who's selling their rating programs and products, because this is what teachers in the schools looking for. Something that's supported by the science for reading instruction and the intervention that should works for our students, right? We often hear that programs claiming that they incorporate science into their reading instruction and their materials are science reading approved, or that their approach is evidence-based or research-based. These kinds of claims are everywhere. While many or some of these programs or products may be fantastic, they sound so convincing, but not all of them are backed by high quality evidence, which is the truth. Someone, may be not effective and not work for students at all. And I think it would be good for us to let's begin with a foundational question. What is the science of rating? You've likely heard this term used a lot, but it's more than a trend. The science of rating can be understood as three interconnected aspects. First, it's the body of research that supports evidence. It's an interdisciplinary knowledge that's based grounded in peer-reviewed research, and this research typically explores something like students' literacy outcomes, like what instructional methods are most effective, and maybe what cause reading difficulties, which are all primarily from cognitive and behavioral psychology. And second, the science of reading includes how that research is translated into practice, which is science. This is where we translate from research findings into practices that including for our instructional strategies, assessments, and curriculum decisions that teachers can actually use in the classrooms. But it's important to remember that these practices are often tentative. They're not one size fits all solutions, and their effectiveness can depend on some specific conditions, like what are your specific students' needs? What are the classroom contexts or the implementation's quality? And then the third part, the science rating also involves some system level implementation. It's about the broader sociocultural movement and how educators, schools, and the entire systems adopt and sustain practices that align with the science. And this component is essential because even the most rigorous research won't make a difference if it does not reach classrooms in a practical and consistent way. And that's why efforts like professional development, instructional coaching, leadership support, and also fidelity monitoring are not just the add-ons, they are the key for science rating stake. So that's science reading, the three components. When we see a program is SOR aligned or SOR approved, it's important to ask, is it built on the scientific evidence? Is it usable in science or practice? And has it been effectively implemented and shown to make a difference in the real school settings? Understanding these layers help us to go beyond just the buzzwords and stay grounded in what truly helps students learn to read. So at the Iowa Reading Research Center, we see our role as translators that bridging the gap between the rigorous research and real-world practices. Our strength is to translate the complex evidence from research and ensure that what happens in classrooms is grounded in high quality scientific evidence. And so educators have the tools and understanding to effectively implement the practices that align with the science reading. And as educator, I think that's why we need evidence-based practices, not only because it is based on reliable evidence, that means it's something that has been tested rather than it's from some personal ideas or anecdotal experiences, but also because, they are likely to be effective in achieving the desired outcomes, and they are more likely to be accepted by the stakeholders when making some important decisions about instruction or interventions. So it will ultimately be benefiting our students. And I think if you look at the requirements that are put forth in the Every Student Succeeds Act, the ESSA, the Federal Department of Education has put together some expectations that every literacy programs or any literacy practice should use evidence-based practices. Since for all designated schools, the evidence-based instruction and interventions needs to be an important part of their action plan. So here, when we see a practice or program is evidence-based, we simply mean that it was developed using research that demonstrates its effectiveness. It's supported by the research studies showing that it works in real educational settings. Then another label that's being used a lot, or you have heard a lot, is research-based. It's a broader concept. So, what is research? And there are a few key components of research that you can consider. First, research is purposeful. That means it's methodological and grounded in a clear question or hypothesis. Researchers design studies with intention and structure to answer some specific research questions. The second, research is transparent. This means the process of doing a research study is clearly documented and can be replicated by some other researcher. Transparency allows other researchers to test, verify, or build upon the work. And then third, good research also produces findings that are both valid and reliable, which can actually reflect what they are intended to study, and reliable findings, are just consistent across time or conditions. These are three key components for research. And now let's shift to thinking more specifically about what research is trying to do. So, one of the core goals of many research studies, especially in applied research in education, is to establish causality. In other words, researchers want to find out, does X cause Y? Or more specifically in literacy, like, does using a particular curriculum or instructional approach, like treatment A or intervention A, lead to some improved reading achievement scores? Let's see, outcome B. Does A lead to B? So the primary goal of research is to isolate this effect of the treatment to determine whether it actually causes the change, rather than the change is connected to the outcome by just a coincidence. But things like in social studies, especially education, are rarely that straightforward. There are so many moving parts. Students bring different backgrounds, teachers have different styles, classrooms have different cultures. So even when a study shows a positive effect, we have to ask, was it really the treatment or something else? That makes isolating a single cause much more complex in a laboratory setting. And that's why educational research must be interpreted carefully, with an understanding of context and its nuances, because every classroom or school is different. So, how do we make sure a study fits our classrooms and its schools? I will walk you through in the next few slides. Because this brings us to an important point. We need more than just one study to trust something that really works, because multiple studies support for converging evidence. And one study is just one study. Even a well-designed, high-quality study only gives us a snapshot of what happened under specific conditions, with specific students, teachers, and settings. So even if one study shows that a program or a strategy that worked, that doesn't mean it will work the same way for everyone and everywhere. And that's why strong evidence usually comes from multiple studies that showing similar results in different settings. And when we see that, we can feel more confident that the practice is truly effective from the converging evidence. However, when we're looking at converging evidence, it can get a little messy. because the more studies we examine, the more differences we tend to see, not just in the results of each study, but in how the study was done. Like some might use small sample sizes, other studies might not include a comparison group, which can make it a lot of differences. And those differences in how studies are done can lead to very different results, even when they're testing the same program or intervention. So, like one study might show that something really works well, that's showing a strong positive effect, while another study shows that it doesn't work at all. And that's why sometimes it gets really messy. So converging evidence isn't always clean or consistent, but using those converging evidence and stepping back to look at the big picture can help us avoid putting too much weight on just one study. So to help ground all of these labels, let's take a moment to clarify the key definitions for each, because these terms often get used interchangeably, but they mean different things. Evidence-based refers to the practices that are supported by scientific research, which is ideally through multiple well-designed studies that consistently show positive results. And then research based, that means it is grounded on some existing research, but it may not have been tested directly or evaluated for effectiveness through rigorous studies. And then the last one, SOR-Approved, it typically means that it aligned with the science rating principles, the three interconnected components that we discussed earlier in the previous slides. So it is built on research with strong evidence, but also designed to be applied effectively in the classroom to teaching students how to read. And if we try to differentiate those terms, here's a simple way to help you think about them. The evidence-based means the practice has been tested through multiple studies and has shown to be effective. So the key point here is that the practice has been proved to have an effect. Although there can be different levels of evidence and varying degrees of effectiveness, and we also have some formal criteria to guide us to evaluate the quality of evidence, which we will look at in the next few slides. And then the research-based just means it's informed by research as theory, but the program itself may have not been directly tested. And then the SOR approved typically means that a program's aligns with the key criteria from the science rating that reflects the most scientifically supported understanding of what to teach and how to teach rating. And these components have the strongest evidence for improving reading outcomes for typical readers or like other students with disabilities and those at risk of reading difficulties. But I know finding high quality evidence-based practice, especially in reading, is not always easy because there's so much information out there, right? And not all research is equally strong. Some practices are highly effective, while others, have little or weak evidence behind them. So I want to ask one question. When we talk about using evidence-based practices, have you ever wondered the quality of evidence? I know we absolutely want strong, trustworthy research to back our decisions. And fortunately, there are some established standards to help with this. The first one is the Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA. They outline some tiers of evidence. And then the WordWorks Clearinghouse, the WWC, they also provide some practice guides and reviews of interventions. And then the American Educational Research Association, which is a research entity, also sets some research standards that are useful when reading academic studies that you need to refer into. And then the Council for Exceptional Children offers some criteria for special education practices. While each of these focus on slightly different areas, they all help schools and educators identify what are the true evidence-based that works for all diverse of learners. So let's talk about ESSA first, the Every Student Succeeds Act, which gives us a very helpful framework for evaluating the evidence. ESSA outlines 4 tiers of evidence based on the factors like study design and rigor and some other components of a research study. And these standards are especially important when schools use federal funds, since qualifying federal programs must meet some certain evidence requirements. So ESSA groups different types of research into 4 tiers, from tier 1 to tier 4. Tier 1 is strongest, the strong evidence that helping us understand how the quality of evidence can vary depending on the type of study. So you can see from this pyramid here that each tier is associated with a different type of research, ranging from the strongest to less rigorous forms. And this structure can help us evaluate how much confidence we can place in a study's findings. All of these studies offer some valuable insights into literacy education, but they don't all provide the same level of evidence. So these are the kinds of research we will unpack as we walk through the hierarchy of evidence on the next few slides. So again, I just want to emphasize that not all evidence is created equal. When we evaluate a practice or program, it's important to consider not just whether there's research behind it, but what kind of research supports it. Different types of studies or different types of research offer different levels of evidence, which can generally be ranked from lower to higher quality. And I'll talk through these different levels of evidence so we can better understand that. The lowest level of evidence, probably the most common one that we can encounter in everyday's conversations, word of mouth or experts' opinions. This is when someone, maybe a colleague, a teacher, an administrator, or even a vendor that you encounter, they may say, like, trust me, this works. And maybe I know sometimes it does work for them, but without data or any research to back it up, we can't be sure it will work in your classroom with your students. But it's a starting point, it's not a stopping point. So then next, we move up to some descriptive research or case studies. These provide a narrative of what happened in a particular setting. Maybe a school implemented a new phonics program or saw some improvements. This kind of descriptive studies help us learn from the real world experiences, but they don't include a comparison group or control or for other factors, which means usually it's a case study. So while those information from this kind of study is helpful for generating some ideas, but they cannot show the cause and effect, which we mentioned before. One of the purpose of research is to create causality, right? And then at level 3, we begin to see a moderate level of evidence. This usually comes from some intervention studies that examine the effectiveness of a specific intervention program or a practice, but they don't use any random assignment. For example, a study might compare two classrooms or two groups of students, which one group may have chosen or have been purposefully selected to use a new program, while the other group could just to continue with the traditional approach. So this process is considered non-random assignment or non-randomized because the two groups were not assigned by chance. That means we can't fill out the selection bias. So because maybe one group has stronger raters to begin with, right? So there's more rigor at this level than basic just observational studies or case studies. But the lack of random assignment limits how confidently we can interpret the results. And still, the studies at this level gives us a moderate level of confidence or moderate level of evidence in the program's effectiveness. The next level of evidence, which is usually can provide moderate to high or high quality evidence, usually comes from any single research study that use random assignment, or what we just call them as randomized controlled trials, RCTs. So these are commonly considered a gold standard in research. So in a study with random assignment, participants are randomly assigned to either the intervention group or a comparison or control group. And if the intervention group performs better than the control group, we can be more confident that the program itself actually caused the improvement rather than other factors. With that said, even a well-designed research study with random assignment is still just a one study. So, like what we see, one study is just a one study. We still need to be cautious about generalizing those results because what works in one setting may not work the same way in another school, classroom, or population. And that brings us to the top of the evidence hierarchy, which is a body of multiple sources of evidence that can give us some high quality evidence. And this means multiple independent studies, often, conducted in similar or even different settings. They may have different populations too, but each story contributes a piece of the overall picture. So when we can combine them, we get what we discussed earlier, the converging evidence. And this kind of consistent and replicated findings from research gave us the strongest confidence in a practice or program's effectiveness. So this is the level of evidence that we are aiming for when evaluating or we need to identify something that has strong and evidence-based practices. So now that we know the quality of evidence or tied to the kind of research behind it, but there's also some other key components in a research study that how strong that evidence really is. The sample, the results of the study, the findings of the study, and also how well the study matches your context. And then in order to be rated as high quality evidence or the tier 1 or tier 2, which is the strong and moderate evidence under SS requirements, it usually requires a decent sample size in a study. And ESSA is pretty clear about that. So they required that studies included at least 350 participants across more than one district or school can usually provide strong evidence. And the second, about the results of the study, as mentioned previously, effectiveness means there's a positive effect on a student outcome. So if you are considering a program or practice, you want to see the evidence of a meaningful positive effect. And there's no other strong negative findings in the related research studies. This also connects back to the idea of converging evidence, which needs to come from multiple sources of evidence that consistently showing effectiveness. And finally, it's also important to consider how well the study's population and setting match your own. If the study was conducted in classrooms or schools that's similar to yours, you can have more confidence that the results will apply to your students too, because the more similar the match is, the more likely the results will translate effectively to your context. So, sample, I think, is an important part of any research study, but it's also important to understand the differences between the sample and population. Because in research, the sample refers to the group of students who actually participated in the study, while the population is a larger group that we hope the findings will apply to. For example, when the population is all K-12 students with learning disabilities, then in a research study, the sample could be like we included 100 kids with learning disability in this study. So when we think about the quality of evidence, a question to ask that related to sample is how well the sample reflect the population that you care about, because it's important to take a closer look at the characteristics of the sample in the study, such as the student's age, their gender, race, ethnicity, or even like their cultural or language background, to see if they truly represent the broader population you're interested in. And that's why important, not just to look at the results of a research study, but also to ask who were those results based on? Even strong findings may not mean much if the sample doesn't reflect your students. And if there's a mismatch, we have to be more cautious about applying those results to your own school or your classroom context. And then about match, it's also important to remember that no research study is perfect. And it's rare for a study to be perfect fit for your specific school or classroom. And one of the challenges is that many studies don't fully report details about the school environment, the student demographics, or how the program was implemented. There could be, only a few pieces of information in the research reporting those information. So that could make it harder to know, if the findings really apply to your context. And that's why, as educators and leaders, we need to look closely at the available details and ask, does this study really reflect the kind of setting and the students that I work with? The better the match, the more confidence you can have in the evidence from the research study. So now that we have talked about the sample and the match, we also mentioned there that there should be some positive effect and no strong negative findings in order to have some strong evidence. Most studies today, I think, report effect sizes, which help summarize the results, which is the degree of the effectiveness. That tells us not just whether something worked, but also how much it worked. So we usually use effect sizes to measure the strength of the effectiveness. That can help us to measure the degree of the practical impact of a practice on an expected outcome. So about effect sizes, there are three main families: the mean differences, the correlations, and also the odds ratio. And in literacy research, we most often deal with the mean difference family, especially the Cohen's d and Hedger's d. That gives us a standardized way to interpret how much better the treatment group performed compared to the control group, especially across different studies if you are looking at converging evidence. So the effect sizes like Cohen's d or Hedger's g, they are reported usually as single values that range from negative to positive infinity. But in education research, they typically fall between the -1 and the +1. These are usually much smaller than 1. And a value of 1 would actually represent a very large or an ideal effect. So when you see effect sizes reported in the research studies or that reported by some curriculum providers, if we see effect sizes about zero point 0.5, that means the treatment group performed half a standard deviation better than this control group. And these numbers help us to evaluate how meaningful the impact actually is when you apply that for your students. And there's also some general guidelines for the interpretation of those effect sizes. Usually, an effect size near zero means there is no impact. And between 0.01 and zero point 0.2 is considered it's a small effect. And between 0.2 and 0.4, which is average effect. And any effect size that is over 0 0.5 or between 0 0.5 and 0.8, it is usually a strong and good effect. Or anything that's above 0 0.8 is considered to be a very large effect. But remember, these ranges of effect size help us to interpret the strengths of an intervention or a program or a practice, but we always have to consider the context. The context is the key because, like, a small effect size in a large, diverse population might actually be more meaningful than a large effect that found in a tightly controlled or limited setting. And that's why it's important to use these numbers with your understanding of your students' unique needs and your context. So far, I think we have talked about the key standards and concepts for evaluating the quality of evidence. And now I'd like to shift the gears and share a few more practical tips and resources to help you find some reliable evidence in the real world settings. We will look at some steps you can take to determine what truly works for your students using a more systematic approach. And the goal is to make sure that the practices we choose are not only backed by strong research, but also can be translated into practices and actionable in your context. So first, if you need to find out what evidence is already on the topic, for example, if you're interested in finding an effective instructional strategy or intervention, there's a few sources you can start with. Like the peer-reviewed journal articles is my to go-to because the research journals usually use a rigorous peer review process that provides some assurance that what gets published is of high quality. And then another type of publication source that educators could rely on are books. But there's a lot of commercially published books out there. They may vary in quality, and there's one type of book that you can find some high quality information about reading are the research handbooks, like the handbooks of reading research or handbooks of early literacy research. You can find some evidence-based practices that's being studied and summarized in the handbooks. And then the third type of publications and resources that are out there, some of you may have heard, National Reading Panel or National Early Literacy Panel. They also have some reports on reading research studies as well, or like the US Department of Education's Institute for Education Science, which is IES. They also have quite a few documents that they can um, provide some information on the evidence-based practices, which they call are the practice guides, such as they report on some foundational skills to support reading for understanding in kindergarten through third grade. And another one is the reading interventions for students in grades 4 through grades 9. Or others, I think you might have saying on their website that the content in them is usually solid to support evidence-based practices. And then after identifying practice that's supported by high quality evidence, the next step is to assess whether it's actually doable in your context. This means taking a close look at the resources you have available. Some things to consider include like, do you have the funding to support it, or do you have the staff and personnel that's needed to implement it? And how many students would need the support? Or even like, do you have access to the technical assistance or training that's necessary to troubleshoot the challenges along the way? And these practical considerations can help ensure that you could apply the evidence-based practice that you selected in a systematic and a sustainable way. Then another factor to consider is your timeline and educational goals. Think about whether the outcomes supported by the evidence align with what you are hoping to achieve, both in the short term and the long term. For example, if your goal is to see some quick improvements in foundational reading skills within a semester, then you will want to choose a practice that has demonstrated some short-term gains. Then on the other hand, if you're focused on some long-term growth in comprehension or like literacy achievement over several years, the evidence should support those broader outcomes. So making sure the practice align with your specific goals and timeline help ensure that you're choosing the right fit for your students and school priorities. So in many cases, implementing a new evidence-based practice isn't easy. It can be difficult sometimes because it takes time, it takes resources and commitment, and you may not see the immediate results, which is frustrating. But as you working through the process, it's natural to wonder, does it really work better than what we have done before? Especially if you're trying something new, regularly checking both how students are progressing and how closely the practice is being followed can help you decide whether it's working in the way. So whether it's worth continuing. And to answer that question, I think it's important to monitor two key things. One is the student progress, and the other is the fidelity of implementation. The fidelity here simply means whether the practice is being implemented the way that it was designed to be. While I think some level of teacher adaptation is expected, sometimes even, necessary. But research shows that practices implemented with higher fidelity tend to be more effective and more likely to produce the intended student outcomes. So, to summarize all of the above, here are a few additional questions that for you to keep in mind when determining whether something that's really evidence-based and aligned with the science rating that works for the students. First, to what extent has this program been evaluated by outside sources? If the only people claiming that it works are the ones who is selling it, are those people associated in any way with a publishing company? I believe these are some potential red flags. And then second, what effects are actually described in the studies? Are you seeing some meaningful improvements in the student outcomes? Because look beyond those weak claims, like what skills improved and by how much, those are very important evidence that you can see or you can tell from those strong research and the converging evidence. And then what level of evidence does it have? You know, are you seeing the evidence that is just some anecdotal feedback, word of mouth, or is from a single case study? Or are they looking at some multiple studies that they have some converging sources of rigorous evidence, high quality evidence? So I believe those kinds of critical questions are important to keep in mind because using or thinking about those questions, we can shift from simply accepting those three claims and labels to actively evaluating and identifying what counts as high quality evidence in relation to the science rating. So I believe that's all of our webinars for today. And thank you all for joining us. And I like to open it up now for any questions, reflections, or insights that you'd like to share. Really appreciate your participation. Thank you.